My life, Evelyn Harper, a 65-year-old widow living in the small town of Roseburg, Oregon, seemed as peaceful as any other home here. My silver hair was neatly tied back. My blue eyes still retained the gentleness of my youth, but behind that exterior were deep feelings that only I understood. That Saturday afternoon, pale yellow sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, dyeing the whole room with a warm, heartwarming color. The familiar smell of herb-roasted chicken filled the house, my specialty, and the dish that my two beloved grandchildren, 10-year-old Emma and 14-year-old Liam, adored the most. I wore an old floral apron, my hands quickly preparing dinner, my heart filled with rare anticipation. This house, every corner, every item, is filled with memories of Robert, my late husband. The pendulum clock stands quietly in the corner of the living room, ticking steadily like the whisper of time. The ceramic dishes have faded over the years, a gift Robert bought on that fateful trip to Italy. The old faded photo frames hanging on the wall still record the radiant moments of happiness, a time when laughter and love seemed never ending. Everything is like a silent harmony, reminding me of the past that my heart has never let go. The doorbell rang, pulling me out of my reverie. My son Daniel, his wife Clara, and their two children walked in. Daniel, 40, still looked successful and elegant in his business suit, but his eyes were often glued to his phone. Clara, 38, looked modern and dynamic and was no less impressive. Her fingers were constantly sliding across the screen, updating news and social networks. Emma and Liam, my two favorite grandchildren, quickly retreated into their own worlds on the iPad and phone, swiping away, oblivious to the space around them. I gently placed the hot roast chicken on the table, trying to create a warm atmosphere, evoking a sense of old family reunion. "Mr. Robert used to love your roast chicken," I said, my voice excited. "He kept praising it after it was done. He even insisted that you make mashed potatoes, too." I looked at Daniel, waiting for a nod, a smile, or just a look of approval, but he just mumbled something incoherent, his eyes still glued to the screen. Clara was no better, nodding perfunctorily and returning her attention to her phone. Liam had his headphones on, his fingers moving restlessly, his eyes drifting somewhere in a world I couldn't touch. Emma glanced at me occasionally, but her eyes were quickly drawn back to the bright iPad screen. The atmosphere around the table became suffocatingly awkward. The clanging of knives and forks, Liam's grumbling at losing games, and the constant phone notifications from Daniel and Clara. The silence of the old laughter became heavy and haunting. I felt my heart sink. An invisible wall, cold and growing thicker, was separating me from my own family. They sat in front of me, but their souls had drifted to a faraway place, a place I could no longer find my way to. I tried to pull them back with a few old stories, asking them about school and friends, but received only short, reluctant answers. The feeling of being ignored, of being left out, even though no one said anything, still weighed heavily in the space. I have devoted my life to raising this family. Since Robert left, Daniel has become everything to me. I have put aside many personal dreams, given up many personal aspirations, just to care for my son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren. But now I realize, perhaps all those efforts are just echoes of the past. I am no longer the center of this house, but just an old woman, trying to keep up a tradition that no longer has a place in the modern world. Tonight's dinner, which should have been a time for gathering, turned into a sad reminder that the ultimate loneliness sometimes comes not from being alone, but from being forgotten by the people you love the most. After dinner, when dessert was served, the atmosphere around the table was still heavy, filled with awkward silence. The dim yellow light from the chandelier did not bring a cozy feeling, but only highlighted the coldness that was enveloping the place. I tried to suppress the sobs in my heart, trying to find a warm and familiar enough topic to break the invisible wall that was gradually building between me and my loved ones. In my memory, I still clearly remember Liam's bright eyes when he told me about the camping trip in Yosemite National Park, a place he once described as a paradise in the mountains and forests, with towering ancient trees, sparkling stars at night, and games filled with laughter. Liam, I began, trying to keep my voice light and casual. That trip to Yosemite you told me about the other day, it sounded great. It's beautiful, right? When are you going? What have you prepared? I turned to Daniel and Clara, forcing a smile. Grandma wants to come too. I still have Robert's old tent. It's still sturdy. We used to love camping, traveling all over the place. I hoped the trip would be an opportunity, a bridge to reconnect the broken ties in my family. I imagined myself sitting around a campfire with my grandchildren, telling jokes under the stars, walking along pine-covered trails. A faint light flickered in my heart, that I could still be a part of this world, of the people I loved. But Daniel and Clara's gazes extinguished that light faster than the wind blowing through the crack in the door. They glanced at each other, hesitation evident in each blink. An awkward silence passed, so long that I felt like the whole room was holding its breath. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice off-key and evasive. Mom, this trip is just for our small family. The tents are too small. There's probably not enough room for many people. He scratched his head, awkwardly avoiding my gaze. Clara quickly continued, her voice sweet, but unable to hide her implicit refusal. Yes, actually, we had planned this trip in advance. It was quite unexpected, so it was not convenient for you to come along. You understand, we wanted to have some private time with the children. A forced smile appeared on her lips, but in my eyes, it was like a sugar-coated knife, sharp and unintentional. Liam and Emma, still glued to the screen, were completely indifferent to the story, as if I was just a faint background noise in their own world. A chill ran down my spine. My heart contracted as if someone was squeezing it. I tried to smile, trying to hide the feeling of being broken inside. I said it was okay. I said I understood. But in reality, a heavy stone had just fallen on my heart, shattering it into pieces. The feeling of being excluded, of being rejected, of being considered an extra in my own family. It came faster, stronger, and more painful than any harsh words. I sat there, looking at Daniel, looking at Clara, looking at Liam and Emma, and in that moment I realized I was a stranger in the house I had built with my life. The years of sacrifice, the meals I cooked, the nights I stayed up to watch over my grandchildren, it all seemed meaningless. I was no longer the mother, the grandmother they loved. I was just a useful person, relied on when needed and quietly discarded when no longer valuable. This was not just a rejection. It was the first clear and painful sign of the truth I was forced to face. I could not continue to live like this. I could not continue to be a quiet shadow on the sidelines of my own life. I had to change. I had to find myself again, the real Evelyn Harper, the woman who had been strong, who had dreams, and who believed she was worthy of love. After Daniel, Clara, and the children left, the house fell into a numbing silence. The space around me seemed to have been drained of life. Every wall and every door seemed to be complaining about my meaningless presence. I stood silently at the kitchen counter, my hands mechanically washing the dishes like a soulless corpse, my mind drifting between fragments of memories and confused emotions. Loneliness came, like an undertow that pulled me down into a dark ocean of nameless tears. As I bent down to wipe the table, my eyes chanced upon a stack of old magazines hidden by a corner of the tablecloth. Something was sticking out, a printed sheet of paper, something Clara had apparently left behind. Curious, I picked it up, thinking at first it was just a discarded bill or advertisement. But as soon as I read the first few lines, my heart sank. It was a Yosemite National Park camping reservation. The words were as clear as a knife carved into my heart. Confirmed reservation for 10 people at Valley View Campground, date X, month Y. I read the number over and over again, 10 people, as if it were some cruel joke. They had told me there wasn't enough tent space, that this was a small family trip. But the black and white paper revealed the truth they had tried to hide. With shaking hands, I turned to the next section, the guest list. Daniel Harper, Clara Harper, Liam Harper, Emma Harper, John Smith, Sarah Smith, Emily Brown, David Green, Anna White, Mark Johnson. I scanned the names, hoping against hope that I was mistaken. But no, no Evelyn Harper. Not a line, not a word. The name I had proudly carried all my life was now completely absent. I was not just left out of the trip. I was dismissed as if I had never existed. They made excuses about lack of space, but invited friends along anyway. This was no longer mere oblivion. It was a deliberate lie, an inexcusable betrayal. The paper trembled in my hand, and I stood frozen in the cold kitchen. All the hard work, all the sacrifices I had made for Daniel and his family, now cruelly denied. I had believed that I was an important part of their lives, that my presence meant something, but now I was just a shadow, an extra, hidden away from their most memorable moments. I spent my entire life after Robert's death supporting my children and grandchildren, the sleepless nights watching over my sick grandchildren, the times I sold souvenirs to support them financially, the hot meals I prepared in silence. Looking back now, I see it all as a play in which I was the main actor, but whose name was not included in the final script. I was no longer a beloved mother, no longer a respected grandmother. I was just a convenient person, useful when needed and easily discarded when they were annoyed. This truth not only disappointed me, but also cut deep into the roots of trust and friendship that I had worked so hard to build. Tears began to well up, salty and silent, rolling down my time-worn cheeks. I did not cry out loud. There was only a silent, dense pain, like smoldering smoke in a room with no exit. But in the midst of that despair, something quietly arose, not anger nor hatred, but a glimmer of awareness, of self-respect, demanding the right to live again. I can't go on like this, living as a sidekick to other people's lives, living in the shadow of unrequited gratitude. This is a wake-up call. It reminds me that I was Evelyn Harper, an independent woman with dreams, with values. I had my own life before I gave it all up for my family, and now it's time to take it back. Take back the right to live the way I want, the right to exist as a full person, not a shadow. I will not go quietly, no longer be forgotten. That night, I couldn't sleep. The room was quiet, except for the pale moonlight filtering through the window, casting a cold silver light over the thin blanket. I lay awake on the bed, my heart in turmoil. Every breath felt like it was being squeezed by the pain from the camping confirmation letter, a clear demonstration of the cruel betrayal I had never expected. The feeling of being rejected, of being lied to, was like hundreds of small blades silently cutting into my heart. I couldn't stop my thoughts, and the past gradually came rushing back, as clear as an old film suddenly rewound. My mind wandered back to 6 years ago, when Robert, the beloved husband of my entire life, died suddenly of a heart attack. The loss not only took away my life partner, but also the last anchor that held me to the world. Robert had been the person I could share everything with, from silly dreams to simmering worries. When he died, I felt as if I had been cut off from my life roots. In the days that followed, I drifted like a ship on the open sea, without direction, without shore. In an effort to fill that void, I poured my heart and time into Daniel and his small family. I believed that my devotion would give new meaning to life. I became the primary caregiver for Emma and Liam, taking the children to and from school every day, cooking, helping with homework, and lulling them to sleep with old fairy tales. I lent Daniel money to renovate the house, buy a car, and even silently shouldered the expenses he could not afford. I turned down invitations to travel, missed my favorite art classes, and even old friends' gatherings to always be there when needed. I told myself that this was the role of a mother and a grandmother. I remember the moment after Robert's funeral. Daniel held me tight, tears streaming down my face, and he said, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll always be here for you. You'll never be alone." Those words were like a lifeline I clung to during the storm of emotions, but as time went on, they became more and more hollow. The calls became less frequent. When he visited, it was usually to ask me to babysit or help financially. Daniel and Clara's eyes when they entered the house were always hurried, tired, never really stopping on me. They were there, but not present. I lulled myself into thinking that my presence was still important, that I was an essential part of their lives. I accepted being an invisible assistant, always ready to support, always enduring, just hoping to keep a little bit of the warmth of the fading relationship. I closed my eyes to the indifference, pretending not to see Daniel's cold gaze every time I asked too many questions, or Clara's annoyed frown when I gave advice. But now, with that cold confirmation letter in hand, there was no way to avoid the truth. I was no longer a part of them. I was no longer a mother, no longer a grandmother. I was just a resource, a free service, to be used when needed and discarded when no longer valuable. No outright rejection, just sweet lies covering up pre-calculated decisions. Hot tears fell onto the pillow, soaking the fabric and my skin. I didn't cry out loud. I was used to holding them in. But inside me was a storm of pain and anger, not only directed at Daniel and Clara, but also at myself, the one who had blindly given without knowing what to keep for myself. I was angry at myself for letting myself be forgotten, overlooked, seen as a blurry background in their family picture. Then, in the thick darkness, a small ray of light crept into my mind. Not the light of revenge, but the light of awareness. I realized if I continued to live like this, I would no longer be myself. I would gradually fade away, silently and meaninglessly. No, I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let them write the end of my life with indifference. I had to change, not to regain a place in anyone's heart, but because I deserved to live fully. I had to find Evelyn Harper again, the woman who had been brave, who had been independent, who had dreams. I no longer had time to wait for someone to save me. I had to step out of the darkness myself, and in that seemingly endless night, amid my last tears, I felt in my heart for the first time in many years. A little peace, a little freedom was budding. A few days after that fateful sleepless night, my mind was still stuck in layers of overlapping thoughts, heavy as fog. The house suddenly became too big, too quiet to be scary. Every footstep echoed with a feeling of emptiness. I sat quietly in the living room, holding an old address book whose spine had been worn over the years. My fingers slowly slid through each unfamiliar name, each friend who had disappeared into the busy pace of life, until stopping at a special name, Margaret Lane, my best friend since college, the one who used to stay up many nights with me discussing life ideals and crazy dreams of youth. But then, when I married Robert and Daniel grew up, our relationship gradually faded. Daniel, my son, never liked Margaret. In his eyes, Margaret was a symbol of rebellion, of unfettered freedom, someone who always encouraged me to be true to myself instead of being constrained by the stereotypes of a family woman. He thought she would pull me away from the safe orbit he had outlined. And perhaps, in order to maintain peace, I gradually avoided Margaret, unconsciously but cruelly. I didn't care what Daniel thought anymore. I needed someone who understood me, someone who knew who I was before I was labeled Daniel's mom, Liam and Emma's grandma. I took a deep breath and pressed the call button. The ringing sound seemed to stretch time, and then a familiar voice rang out, warm and full of life as ever. Evelyn, it's been so many years. Is there something serious calling me at this hour? At first, the conversation was a bit hesitant. We asked each other about life, the trivial things of daily life. But after just a few polite sentences, all the emotions that had been suppressed for so long seemed to burst out. I could no longer hide them. I told Margaret everything, from that strange dinner to the tactful but painful refusal of the camping trip, and finally, the haunting discovery of the reservation letter for 10 people. I told her with all my resentment and bitterness about feeling left out, used, rejected without a single word of honesty. Margaret didn't interrupt me once. She listened with all her heart, with the patience that only true friends possess. Through every little sigh, every sympathetic yes, I felt complete understanding. When I repeated Daniel's comment about there wasn't enough room in the tent, Margaret let out a long sigh, a mixture of regret and pain. I knew this would happen, Eve. You're so good. You've endured so much. They think everything you do is for granted. A few days after that phone call, Margaret flew from Santa Cruz, where she lived, to Roseburg to visit me. I was completely surprised. I felt a strange feeling, surprise and gratitude. Margaret was still the same. Her hair was neatly cut, her eyes were bright, and her smile was full of life. She wore a simple but elegant outfit, carrying with her a sense of freedom and an air of indifference to gossip. She stayed with me for several days, walking with me, listening to me talk about the lingering wounds I had endured over the years. Not only did she comfort me, but she also encouraged me to step out of the shadow of meaningless sacrifices, to start living for myself. Evelyn, she said, her hand clasping mine, her voice as firm as an oath, you've lived for others enough. It's time to live for yourself. Do you remember that dream? The dream of a little house by the sea where we would wake up to the sound of waves and wind? Those words awakened something in me that had long been dormant. That dream, the dream that Robert and I had cherished, I had buried since my husband died, thinking it would never come true. Meeting Margaret was like a strong wind blowing away the dust from my soul. She was not just an old friend, she was a mirror that reflected the real me, strong, vibrant, and full of ambition. In Margaret's eyes, I was not a resigned old woman, but a woman with full value, worthy of love and choosing my own path. Her presence made me feel that I was no longer alone, and for the first time in many years of living as a supporting role, I began to imagine a different future, where I was no longer a shadow behind my family, but Evelyn Harper, the truest, fullest, and most radiant version of myself. After Margaret returned to Santa Cruz, my home in Roseburg seemed to change. It was no longer the warm, sheltering home that had sheltered me through the years, but an invisible cage holding me between fading memories and gradual oblivion. Margaret's words still echoed somewhere in my mind, like a call from another world, a world I once belonged to, then forgot. She opened a door that I had long thought locked, throwing the key deep down in my heart. One afternoon, I sat on the porch, a cup of warm tea in my hand, my eyes on the familiar garden bathed in pale sunlight. The air was peaceful and gentle, but inside me a quiet storm was raging. I imagined Margaret sitting across from me, telling me about Santa Cruz in an excited voice. She described the beach there as a love song of freedom, the waves lapping the shore day and night, tirelessly, as if whispering to the earth and sky. She spoke of a small but loving community where every smile was sincere, every greeting warm. The pretty little houses, covered with wildflowers, nestled along ancient cobblestone streets, all appeared in my mind like a vivid picture. And Margaret didn't stop there. She told of the dawn at sea, when the first light shone through the thin mist, dyeing the vast space golden. She told of the seagulls singing loudly in the deep blue sky, of the salty smell of the sea permeating the wind, seeping into the skin and soul. She told of the simple but profound joy of walking on the sand every day, alone with the vast ocean, without constraints, without judgment, a pure and absolute freedom. Those images awakened something in me, a dream that I thought had faded away over the years, the dream of a small house by the sea. That dream had been kept by Robert and me like a sweet secret. We had sat together, hand in hand, envisioning our old age amidst the sound of the waves and the light of dawn. Robert had looked at me with gentle eyes and said, "When we retire, we will move to the sea, Eve. Live life slowly, peacefully. Wake up to the sound of the waves instead of an alarm clock." That dream, which seemed to have turned to dust along with the farewells to him, now came back to life, fiercely, presently, urging me to walk towards it. I began to think seriously about selling the house in Roseburg. It held so many memories, every wall, every step, every door marked with the love Robert and I had built. Leaving it would be like closing a chapter in my life. More than just moving, it would be a farewell to the past, to the things I loved so deeply, and the thought choked me up. I had imagined myself living here forever, where I could whisper to Robert every day through the things I had left behind. But then, the image of a new life, a life where I could be myself, grew in my mind. I began to see the Evelyn of tomorrow clearly, no longer bound, no longer looked down upon or used. I was no longer Daniel and Clara's always there, but a free woman with her own choices, her own life. That feeling of excitement gradually overcame my fear. I felt like I had been given a second chance, not to redo the past, but to redefine myself. A part of me, the dreamer, the longer, the braver, is waking up, stretching as if it had never been asleep. For the first time in a long time, I feel a clear and strong calling, not from someone else, but from within myself. And from afar, through my imagination, I hear the sea whispering. The sea is calling my name. After many sleepless nights of tossing and turning, the idea of selling the house in Roseburg no longer seemed crazy or foolish. It became a necessity, a way out, the only way for me to free myself from the shackles of the past, to step into a wide open future where I could be my true self. The initial fear gradually faded, replaced by a quiet but firm determination. I sat in the familiar living room, my eyes scanning each item that had accompanied me for so many years. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows, catching the dust particles floating in the air as if time were slowing down, slow enough for me to say goodbye to the old things and make the most important decision of my life. I took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and found the number of Susan Carter, a well-known real estate agent in the area. She had helped several of my friends buy and sell homes and was always praised for her dedication and professionalism. When the phone picked up, I didn't hesitate and said, "Hello, Mrs. Carter. This is Evelyn Harper. I want to sell my house as soon as possible." Although my voice was still a little shaky, every word I spoke carried unwavering determination. I was ready for this move, completely and utterly. Susan, a brisk middle-aged woman with a confident demeanor and a pleasant face, seemed a little taken aback by the sudden call, but remained professional. She asked me some basic information about the house and promptly made an appointment for the next day to take a closer look. On time, Susan showed up at my house the next morning. She carried a thick folder, a tablet, and a reassuring smile. Susan walked around the house, carefully observing every detail, from the porch to the window frames, as if every corner was important. She took careful notes, her eyes missing nothing. After completing the survey, Susan sat across from me in the living room, flipping through the documents, then looked at me with the twinkle in her eye of someone who brings good news. Mrs. Harper, she said, her voice full of excitement. I think you'll be happy to hear this. The real estate market in Roseburg is hot. Given the location, the size, and the state of maintenance, your home is worth much more than the average. If we offer it at the right price, I believe we can not only sell it quickly, but also get a very substantial return, enough for you to buy a nice condo in Santa Cruz and still have enough left over to live comfortably in your retirement years. Her words took me by surprise. A sense of relief washed over me. For so long, financial worries had been a constant hold on me, a silent but heavy barrier that held me back from my dreams. But now that wall had cracked. Before me was a new door, wide and full of promise, leading to a world I had only imagined. Yet amid the excitement, a flicker of doubt crept into my mind. Would I be able to adjust to life in a foreign place? Without Daniel, without my little grandchildren, where every street and every face was new? I was so used to Roseburg, with its familiar paths, its old trees, its neighbors who knew each other by sight, leaving all that would mean starting over, at an age when people usually just want to settle down. But then I thought about the years that had passed, the years I lived as a devoted grandmother, always present, always sacrificing, always taken for granted. I thought about the times I was ignored, taken advantage of, pushed aside as if my feelings were superfluous. I had endured too much, lost myself for too long. I didn't want the last years of my life to be just a series of days of loneliness and regret. This was my time, the opportunity to escape the shadow of others, to live a life that was my own, without anyone else having the right to decide for me. I'm going to sell this house, I said to Susan Carter, my voice clear and firm, as if I were making an oath to myself. I trust you, Susan. Help me get this done as soon as possible. That decision for me was not simply selling an asset. It was a liberation, a final farewell to the pain that had been buried for too long. I felt like a large stone had just fallen from my chest. I was taking the first steps on the journey to find freedom, true freedom. A different life was waiting for me ahead, and for the first time in many years, I chose myself. A few days after I decided to sell my house, I got a call from the local post office. They said an important package, which was supposed to be addressed to Daniel, had somehow been delivered to my house by mistake, probably because of some extra information mixed up in the system. Daniel was away on a business trip and couldn't come back to pick it up. He called me, sounding tired but still trying to be polite, and asked me to come by his house and pick it up and deliver it to him when I had the chance. I hesitated. I didn't want to go there, but thinking of my motherly love, now faded, I reluctantly agreed. I drove to Daniel's house. Everything was neat and tidy, a house that was well kept on the outside but lacked the soul of a family. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, illuminating the polished wood floors of the quiet living room, highlighting the cold emptiness. I walked into the study, where Daniel kept important documents. The package lay neatly on the table, carefully wrapped. I bent down to pick it up, but my eyes fell on a thick file lying crookedly beneath a pile of books, as if someone had pulled it out and shoved it back in a hurry. A large, bold headline caught my eye. Mortgage Agreement, X House, Y Street, Roseburg, Oregon. I froze. My heart clenched. It was my home address. There was no mistake. I picked up the file with trembling hands, my eyes skimming over each line, each clause. The more I read, the colder my blood ran. It was a contract to borrow a large sum of money from a finance company, and most horrifying of all, the collateral was the house I lived in, the house Robert and I had built together. The contract was based on the assumption that Daniel would be my sole heir upon my death. I couldn't believe my eyes. I turned the pages, the words, the numbers, the clauses, the cold legalese. It was all laid out plainly, ruthlessly. I saw my own signature on a few of the appendices. The handwriting was familiar, but I had no recollection of signing anything to do with a mortgage. Either the signature had been forged, or, worse, Daniel had taken advantage of me in the period of disorientation after Robert's death, when my mind was confused, weak, and unable to discern truth. He had quietly turned my beliefs against me, coldly and calculatingly. My hands began to shake violently. The file fell to the floor, papers flying as evidence of the ultimate betrayal. I stepped back, hitting the edge of the table, making a dry sound in the silent room. What has Daniel done? I asked myself, my voice hoarse, not knowing whether it was from anger or despair. The damage that had been piling up for years seemed to suddenly burst open. Not just the lie about the camping trip, not just the silent rejection, but now the outright deception, aimed at the last sacred thing I had left. Anger surged through my chest, burning like a fire that consumed all other emotions. Does he think I'm dead? The question echoed in my head, bitter and cold. Daniel no longer saw me as his mother, no longer saw me as a person, just a name to be used, an asset to be exploited. In his eyes, I was nothing more than a walking corpse, an obstacle to his own personal gain. He had erased me from his future, both figuratively and literally. That anger made me more sober than ever. Now the decision to sell the house was not only to free myself, but also a cold but justified response. I no longer felt guilty, hesitant, or doubtful. When the house was sold, when the bank came to collect the debt, Daniel would have to face the consequences of his own making. That was the price he had to pay. Not because I was evil, but because he had crossed the final line. I will not forgive. I will not turn back. I have lost too much, and this time I will not let anyone take it away from me. I will do what I must to protect myself and what is left in this life. After the shock of the mortgage contract, I knew I had no time to hesitate or soften. The feeling of betrayal surged through my chest, condensing into a cold but clear wave, a kind of determination that left no room for weakness. For the first time in years, I knew exactly what I had to do, not only to protect myself, but also to send Daniel an unmistakable message. I was no longer the woman I had once been. The next morning, I made an appointment with Michael Reed, an older lawyer who had worked with Robert and me on a few small legal cases. I remembered him as quiet, measured, and extremely trustworthy. As I walked into Michael's office, a quiet space with ceiling-high bookshelves and a faint smell of old paper, I felt a mixture of confusion and determination. My steps were light but steady, as if I were entering a new chapter in my life. We sat across from each other. I looked up, took a deep breath, and began to recount the whole thing. I held nothing back, from the bland family meals, to the blatant lie about the camping trip, to the email confirming the 10 participants, to the shocking discovery in Daniel's office. My voice was shaky at first, but each sentence felt lighter, clearer, as if I were unraveling the cobwebs in my heart. Michael said nothing, just listened with a focused, understanding gaze. He nodded at certain points, not rushing, not interrupting, like a patient witness to an old confession. When I stopped, the room was silent. Michael pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, looking at me with a heavy, thoughtful gaze. Ms. Harper, what you've just described is not only serious, it could be considered criminal fraud. He began to present options, from filing a lawsuit against Daniel for forgery to taking legal action to regain control of the assets. Each option was reasonable, each legal, but not what I was looking for. I shook my head slightly, my gaze calm but resolute. I had thought it through. I did not want to pursue litigation, not because I was afraid, but because I did not want to waste time, energy, and family honor on protracted legal battles. I did not want justice in court. I needed another way, quieter, more effective, more profound. I needed a clean end and, above all, an act of resistance that would force Daniel to confront his own selfishness. "Thank you, Michael," I said slowly, my voice low and steady. "I'm not going to sue Daniel. I want to change the will." Michael raised his eyebrows, slightly surprised. But he didn't ask why, just nodded and listened. I made my intentions clear. The majority of the money from the sale would go into a trust for Emma and Liam, to be put into effect when they turned 18. I wanted to ensure their educational futures were secure, to give them a path other than their father's shadow and mistakes. It was my gift, not to Daniel, but to the children who weren't old enough to fend for themselves. I paused, then continued. Daniel will still receive a portion, a small amount of cash, a token inheritance. Not enough to pay off his debts, much less maintain the dependent lifestyle he's accustomed to. But it's enough. Enough to keep him from saying I've washed my hands of him completely. Enough to let him experience the consequences of his actions. I decided to donate the rest to the local library, where I had volunteered after Robert's death. During those lonely years, it had been a safe haven, the only place where I felt useful, where I still had some value. I wanted to leave something there, not just a legacy, but a part of my life, a small but genuine legacy. Michael took careful notes, saying nothing more than brief acknowledgments. He processed the paperwork quickly and discreetly, just as I expected. No frills, no drama, just the law and the will, written down, signed, and enforceable. As I walked out of Michael Reed's office, the evening breeze blew gently through my silver-streaked hair. I stood for a moment on the steps, closing my eyes. A sense of relief and serenity washed over me, as if I had just released an invisible shackle that I had carried for so long. For the first time in years, I felt in control, not just of my property, but of my emotions, my honor, my future. By changing my will, I had not only turned the tables, but also reclaimed the right to tell my own story. This time, it was no one else. I was the one who put an end to it. A few weeks later, the Roseburg house was officially put up for sale, and surprisingly, it found a buyer in a short time. The whole process was so quick and smooth that I was almost taken aback. A sense of relief washed over me, as if a heavy weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The house, once a home, once filled with memories, was now a part of my past that I was ready to close. There was nothing holding me back, a place that had become a symbol of hurt, betrayal, and unfulfilled dreams. With Margaret and Susan Carter, my new real estate agent and trusted friend, I boarded a plane to Santa Cruz. But the journey was more than just getting from point A to point B. It was a deeper journey, an inner journey that took me closer to freedom, to my own rebirth. As soon as I set foot on this land of sun and sea breeze, I could feel a completely different energy, light, fresh, and full of promise. The fresh air with a hint of sea salt, the bright light, and even the people on the streets, all exuded openness, as if Santa Cruz was ready to welcome me into a new life. Margaret had prepared a list of possible apartments. We spent the day looking at them. Some were fine, nicely furnished, conveniently located, but none of them really caught my heart. I was starting to feel tired and anxious, afraid that I was dreaming too much, that I might never find the right place. And then, we visited a small apartment located on the top floor of a low-rise building near the coast. The moment I stepped through the threshold, I immediately felt something different. Light filled the space, spreading throughout the room like a warm stream. The apartment was not large, but was harmoniously decorated with soft white and blue tones, creating a strangely peaceful atmosphere. The wide open balcony looked straight out to the ocean, where the white-capped waves lapped tirelessly against the white sand, and the sea breeze carried the salty scent and gentleness of nature. I stepped out onto the balcony, letting the sea breeze caress my silver-streaked hair, letting the smell of salt and the sound of the ocean permeate every breath. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and listened to the seagulls, the waves, the wind, as if nature were playing a symphony just for me. Every cell in my body seemed to awaken from a long sleep. In that moment, I remembered Robert. I remembered our dream of a peaceful place overlooking the ocean where we could grow old together. Even though that dream was unfinished, now I was touching it, alone but stronger than ever. Behind me, Margaret and Susan stood silently. They didn't need to say anything. I knew they understood. They understood that this was more than just an apartment with a view. This was a dream restored, a soul healing. This was the beginning of a new Evelyn Harper, unfettered, unbowed by the past. I turned around, my eyes bright as if seeing the first sunrise after a long night. A smile, no longer forced, but full of life and satisfaction, appeared on my lips. Looking at Margaret, then Susan, I said, my voice trembling but determined, I will buy this apartment. In that moment, I felt like the last invisible thread had been cut. There was nothing holding me back. I had let go, stepped out of my own shadow to choose a new future, a future of my own making. No longer living for others, no longer being controlled by fear. It was a moment of freedom, of courage, and of asserting my own worth, not in words, but in actions. Evelyn Harper, at last, found her way back to herself. No longer a self-sacrificing mother who was used, no longer a wife standing in memory, but an independent, courageous, and proud woman. And here, with the sea breeze, the sunshine, and the peace, is where my new story begins. The day before I officially left Roseburg, with the purchase completed and all I had left to do was wait for the move to Santa Cruz, I sat quietly in the nearly empty living room of my old house. Everything was packed away, save for the few personal items I planned to take with me. There was an eerie silence, a silence that was at odds with the warmth and familiarity of the house. I placed a blank sheet of paper and a pen on the table, took a deep breath, and began to write. A letter to Daniel. This is not a letter of blame or anger. I am not writing to criticize or further damage the already fractured relationship between mother and daughter. I am writing to express, to say goodbye, and more than that, to reestablish the boundaries that I have not dared to set for so long, a way to reclaim the value that I have silently lost. The lines flow slowly, sadly, but calmly, as if I am saying goodbye to a part of my life. I started by explaining why I had sold my house and left. I didn't beat around the bush, I got straight to the point. That I had been cast aside, overlooked in my own family. I brought up the last night, the meal, the lie about the camping trip, the painful truth about the guest list containing 10 of Clara's friends, but not me. I didn't need to use sharp words, just quiet, honest lines that revealed the hurt I had kept bottled up inside. My son, I wrote, I have devoted my whole life, since your father passed away, to being with you and your little family. I have sacrificed my own interests, my quiet desires, just to take care of my grandchildren, to support you through difficult times. I used to believe that this was an expression of love, a sacred connection between mother and child, but then I realized I was just a useful person, present when you needed me and dismissed when you wanted space for yourself. I didn't forget to mention what hurt me the most, the discovery of the mortgage on the house. I didn't accuse her directly, but I left enough clues that I had accidentally found some relevant papers. I can't believe you did this without telling me, I wrote. It made me realize that to you, I was no longer a person with choices, but an asset to be exploited when needed. I didn't need to say more. If Daniel had any conscience, he would know that I knew everything, and I was no longer someone to be fooled. I also made it clear that selling the house and changing the will was not an act of revenge, but a step to protect the future of Emma and Liam, innocent children who deserved a better start, not dragged down by the consequences of their father's mistakes. I still love you, I wrote, and I want the best for you. But I also want you to learn to stand on your own 2 feet, to learn to take responsibility for what you have done and will do, instead of relying on me or anyone else. The letter ended with a clear statement that I wanted to live the rest of my life for myself, no longer as a bystander, no longer as someone to be called upon. I needed to find my true self again, the Evelyn Harper I had once been, strong, independent, and ambitious. I knew Daniel might not understand right away, or ever, but that didn't matter anymore. I folded the letter and put it in a white envelope, leaving no return address, just a simple "to Daniel." I left it on the kitchen table, where he would surely find it when he returned to find the house empty. The letter was a farewell, the end of a chapter, and a final affirmation that I would not let myself be taken advantage of again. I had said everything I needed to say, and now I was ready to walk away without looking back. My new life in Santa Cruz began in peace and splendor. The apartment, though not spacious, was light and cozy, with a balcony facing the vast ocean. Every morning I woke up to the gentle sound of waves lapping on the sand, the cries of seagulls echoing in the sky, and the cool breeze on my skin. These sounds, natural, pure, were a symphony of freedom, a whisper of welcome to the new chapter in my life that I had longed for so many years. I quickly settled into the rhythm of life here, a place completely different from old Roseburg. The Santa Cruz air was airy, liberal, and open. The people were friendly and close, as if they had known each other for a long time. It didn't take long for me to begin to rediscover interests that had been buried by years and responsibilities. The first thing I did was sign up for a local book club. Each week, we would talk about our favorite books, passionately discussing characters, plots, and emotions. I found myself reliving those meetings, living in understanding, in wisdom, and in the joy of being heard. Next, I enrolled in a pottery class at the community center. This had been an unfulfilled dream of Robert and I, something we had always put off because we didn't have time. In the early days, my hands were clumsy. The clay kept slipping from my hands, distorted and rough. But I persevered, and then each vase, each plate gradually emerged, shaped by patience and love. Each finished product was a small victory, a reminder that I could still create something beautiful with my hands. In the small classroom, with the pungent smell of clay and sunlight streaming through the window, my soul gradually healed. I also started volunteering at a senior center near my home. There, I shared my life experiences and listened to old memories from new friends. We sang songs, played games, and reminded each other that there was still much to enjoy in life. For the first time in years, I felt useful, not because someone needed to take advantage of me, but because I was truly appreciated. Margaret, my dear companion, was the bridge that brought me to a new circle of friends. Through her, I met Henry, a retired painter with a silver beard and smiling eyes. Henry loved the sea like I did and also enjoyed early morning walks. We often walked on the sand, talking about painting, about life, about the past. There was a calmness and warmth about him that made me feel safe. I also met Clara, a former yoga teacher who taught me to breathe deeply and slow down. Linda, a talented gardener, inspired me with plants and the earth. They were strong, independent women and radiated a strange, positive energy. Each day passes with new and complete rhythms. In the morning, I walk on the beach, collect seashells, watch the sun rise from the distant horizon. In the afternoon, I spend time with clay, meticulously shaping, listening to the breath of creativity. In the evening, I read books, call friends to chat, or sometimes welcome them to my house, sipping hot tea, listening to the whispering sound of the night sea. My face became brighter. My smile was as constant as the sunshine here. My eyes, once tired in loneliness, now shone with peace and confidence. I was no longer the woman who lived in the past, sad and resigned. I was the new Evelyn Harper, brave, independent, and happy. This life was a gift I gave myself, proof that, although it was late, I dared to stand up, to live true to my desires and values. I found the joy of living again, and most importantly, I found myself again. 4 months after settling in Santa Cruz, my life was truly complete. I had largely put the hurt and betrayal behind me and was immersed in my newfound peace and freedom. One sunny afternoon, I was sitting on the balcony reading a book, listening to the sound of the waves. When the doorbell rang, I was momentarily surprised. It was rare for someone to come in unannounced. I stepped out to open the door, and then, like an old film suddenly playing, I froze. Before me was Daniel. His face was blank, his figure haggard. My son's sunken eyes were filled with worry and exhaustion, as if months of pressure and fatigue had been piled on his shoulders. I didn't need to ask, nor did I need an explanation. I knew what had brought Daniel here. He walked in. The small apartment suddenly felt strangely cramped, weighed down by the heavy presence of tension and unresolved history. Without beating around the bush, Daniel practically burst open the door of emotion. His voice was a mixture of anger and panic, almost screaming. "Mom, what's going on? Why did you sell the house without telling me? The bank is demanding payment of the mortgage. I don't know what to do." His hands were clenched, shaking as if he was trying to grab onto something to keep his balance. I remained calm, steady, as if my inner self had been trained over the years. I invited Daniel to sit down. My voice was not high, but clear, slow, each word as if I had carefully packed it for a long time. I began to recount, not with reproach, but with memory. I mentioned the awkward dinners, the camping trip where I was deliberately excluded, the careless lie that there was not enough room. Then I mentioned the mortgage contract I had accidentally found, a document in my name, which I had never signed, nor had I ever been asked for. I looked straight into my son's eyes, my voice low. "Daniel," I said, "I have devoted my life after your father's death to being there for you, supporting you unconditionally. In return, I have been disrespected. You no longer see me as a mother, but as a convenient tool to be used. I have been pushed aside, without a voice in my own life." I explained that selling the house was not a form of revenge, but a final act of taking back control of my life. "I'm not abandoning my family, son," I said, my gaze fixed on the distant ocean. "I'm just choosing to live for myself. I'm so tired of living for others that I forgot to love myself." I added that I had changed my will, not to punish them, but to ensure a future for Emma and Liam. It was the only thing I could do as a loving grandmother. Faced with the cold but clear truth, Daniel gradually became silent. The initial anger faded, giving way to painful realization. I saw his eyes reddened, shining with heavy regret. He bowed his head, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry, Mom. I was wrong. I was selfish and too heartless. I didn't know how much you had suffered." I looked at the grown son I had placed all my hopes in. Though my heart was still scarred, in that moment I felt a deep peace. I made it clear that I would no longer be involved in his financial affairs. That was a lesson he had to learn for himself. But I added that I still loved the children, and that if he would bring them to visit me in Santa Cruz, I would be happy to do so. Our parting was a silence filled with unspoken words, a fragile understanding, and a hesitant beginning. Daniel walked away with a heavy burden on his shoulders, but this time it was the burden of his own actions, and a lesson he would probably never forget. I sat on the balcony where the sun was setting, dyeing the horizon red. The waves were still rolling, the sea breeze was in my hair, and I took a deep breath. Peace crept into my bones, into my heart. I had found myself again, not just a mother, not just a grandmother, but Evelyn Harper, a whole woman, free and strong. My life did not end in Roseburg. It began again in Santa Cruz, bright, proud, and strong. I learned to love myself, to dare to say no, to dare to choose myself. And that is not selfishness, but courage. I won, not by revenge, but by a meaningful journey of rebirth. And I believe that old age is not the end, but the moment to start the forgotten dreams. Thank you for listening to my story.